Parsha, one of the commentaries on the Rebbe on the Parsha will also get the Hasidic angle in addition to the other angle. Okay, with your permission, we'll start. So this is, I'm starting, this is just going to be a few minutes, maybe we'll do 5 minutes, we'll put a timer. And this is the Tanya, the founding book of Chabad, has 5 sections. The 4th section is letters, a collection of letters that Rabbi Shneir Zalman wrote to various people, and where he explains Hasidic, Kabbalistic concepts. And some of those Kabbalistic concepts are very esoteric, and they're hard to understand, and he explains them. Here is one. What is the history? So the history of this letter, the 27th letter, the history is this is a letter of comfort that the Rabbi Shneir Zalman wrote to the Hasidim in Israel. So in the late 1700s, was it early 1800s? There was a Hasidic, maybe it was even earlier, late 1700s. There was a Hasidic aliyah from Eastern Europe to Israel. Most of the group ended up in the city of Tiberias, and this group was led after the passing of the Maggid of Mezrich, after the passing of the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chabad. The founder of the Hasidic movement. I'm totally confused. After the passing of the Maggid, which was the disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chabad, there was a Hasidic leader whose name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach. Sometimes they call him Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. Vitebsk is not too far from where the town of Lubavitch is. It's white Russia. And he was one of the prominent students of the Maggid. Sure, no problem at all.
We understand there's a fridge upstairs. Do you know the code to the
My guess is 1 and 3, so 13-245. 13-245. If it doesn't work, let me know.
Do you have a ladder up there as well?
A ladder? I don't know. We'll look around, closets. Yeah, sorry. Oh, so the leader, 13-245. Yeah, I think. If not, call me. So one of the prominent students of the Maggid was Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach or Vitebsk, depending on where he lived at the time, and he led a group of Hasidim to Israel. Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the founder of Chabad, wanted to go with him, and he actually set out on the journey to go with him to move to Israel. The Chabad history would be different had he actually concluded the journey. Instead, halfway through, he turned around because Rabbi Menachem Mendel convinced him that he has to go back and lead the Hasidim in Eastern Europe. So he turns back. This is a letter years and years later, after the passing of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach. The Hasidim in Israel were mourning, and this is the letter that Rabbi Shneir Zalman, who is back in Europe, sends to Israel to comfort them for the passing of Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach. This is what he writes. And first thing he does, that's why it's in the book, because it's explaining Kabbalistic concepts. So the verse says as follows. The verse says the expression, the euphemism. How do you say someone passes away in the Talmud? Jews don't like to speak negative. They always have to have a positive euphemism. So somebody passes away. The expression in the Talmud is Shavak Chaim. Literally, Shavak is to leave. He left life to us, right? Because if I pass, you don't want to say life is concluded. You don't want to say the life is over. So what you say is he passed on, but he left the life to us. Literally, Shavak Chaim L'chol Chai. He left life to every living being. That's the euphemism in the Talmud. Now, on the surface, you could just say we want to feel good. We don't want to use something. We don't want to use a negative expression, so we use a positive expression, so we don't have to confront the negativity. It's just an escape mechanism. But that's incorrect. Kabbalistically speaking, the euphemism that is used in the Talmud is accurate. Someone passes away. He lives, especially a righteous person. He leaves life to every person. What does that mean? How does it mean that one guy passes away, I get life? What do I have to do with him? It's not like I'm in his will or anything, right? So the point is this. The point is, what is the what is the life of a person? So a person has many aspects of their life, both physically and spiritually. The more righteous the person is, the more that person identifies with the spiritual life. What's the spiritual life? Love of God, awe of God, and faith in God. That's a tzaddik. You ask a tzaddik, how you doing today? It's not what I ate for breakfast. It's not like me. It's like what the weather is. You ask me, you want to know how I'm doing, you look at the weather. But a tzaddik, it depends it depends on his relationship with God. So his relationship with God defines his life. Now, we are his students. How do we get life from him? Do we get the tzaddik's love of God? Do we get his awe of God? Do we get inspired from his faith in God? To a degree. In other words, a ray of his teachings could inspire us. So he gives us life. What is life? Life is his love of God, awe of God, and faith in God. What does he give us? Why do we go to the tzaddik? We want inspiration. What inspiration? We want his life. What's his life? These three emotions: love, awe, and faith. However, when the tzaddik is alive, this energy, his soul, his life, is constrained within the body. So what do we get? We can get a ray. We can get a little bit. So here comes what the Zohar says. And again, that's why it's in this book, because this section of the book is commentary on the Zohar. The Zohar says as follows: the righteous who pass away are accessible, exist. They're present in all the worlds, not just the spiritual worlds, but also in the physical world, even more than in their lifetime. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, I don't understand. If you talk about the spiritual worlds, of course, when the righteous passes away, he's in the spiritual worlds more than in his lifetime. But in this physical world, how could you say the righteous person is here, present in this physical world after the passing more than in their lifetime? It sounds like impossibility. But now this is what Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains. He explains that after the passing, because there's no body, because the tzaddik is not limited in the body, we can actually get the essence of the emotions of the tzaddik. We used to be able to get only a ray. So if you want to connect to the love of the righteous person, to the awe of the righteous person, to the faith of the righteous person, which, as we defined, is really the life of the righteous person. So when he passes away, he leaves us his life. That's what the Talmud says. Shavak Chaim. He leaves life to everybody. What does it mean? He leaves life to everybody. Now his essential life is accessible. It used to be you had to go, you had to meet him. You couldn't always meet him. When you meet, he tells you something. It's a ray. But now we're talking about a spiritual life. Now the life is more spiritual, so you can actually access the essence, and that is what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says. And that's why just an introduction to get us in the spirit of the day. So we want to connect to the tzaddik, but now we can get to the essence, not just to the ray. Go ahead, Steve.
Can we connect this with Revelation?
Go ahead, expand.
That's a question.
Revelation. So in Hasidic teachings, there's always a paradox, and it's actually related to this parsha. And it's Sunday. You get to talk about Korach. There's always a paradox. The paradox is that revelation is a quality. It's revelation, Gilui. The Kabbalists call it Gilui, revelation. Revelation is great because you could see it and you can experience it. But Kabbalah says something very interesting. Certainly Hasidic philosophy says something very interesting. That by definition, the revelation is limited. Because what could you see? You can only see a limited perspective, right? Even in the light, we only see a limited spectrum of the light. There's so much more that we cannot see. So Kabbalah says, ironically, the essence comes when you cannot see it, because you can never see the essence. So in Judaism, in Kabbalistic thought, there's always a I don't want, compromise is the word. If you can see it, it's not the essence. It's wonderful, but it's not the essence. If you can comprehend it, if you could understand it, if you can internalize it, it's inspiring. But if it's inspiring, it's not the essence. If it's the essence, you cannot internalize it because it's too great. That's the paradox. I don't want to get too off track, but the Kabbalah talks about the cycle of the moon, the lunar cycle. So the first half of the month, you're growing, you're waxing. Till 15, you're growing. Second half of the month, you're waning. Until you get to right before Rosh Chodesh, no light whatsoever. Now, we count other cultures that are lunar cultures, count day 1, full moon. We don't. For us, full moon is day 15. So what does that mean? It means the first half of the month you're growing. And what? And the second half of the month, what? You're diminishing? How could that be? We believe in increasing. Malim b'kodesh. You always have to grow in holiness. So why is the Jewish calendar set up? They could have set up the calendar that the full moon is the goal, is day 30. Instead, the full moon is day 15. So the second half of the month, we're diminishing. How could that be? So what's the Kabbalistic answer? The Kabbalistic answer is second half of the month is greater than the first half of the month. Second half of the month, the light is diminishing. And if the light diminishes, you access the essence. And the day before Rosh Chodesh, when there's no light at all, that's where you get to the essence. And because you get to the essence, now there could be rebirth. So the rebirth, the next month, a new beginning, follows the absence of light. Why? Because like Steve says, there's Gilu, there's revelation, and revelation is wonderful, but revelation is capped at a certain degree of how much we can understand and comprehend. But then there's the essence, and it always works that way. There's always a compromise between revelation and essence. If I can express it to you, it's not the essence, right? What happens? I feel strongly, I feel a strong emotion. What do? I say, I love you. Okay? What happens if I feel that emotion, if that emotion intensifies? What happens? I become speechless. Why do I become speechless? If I feel a little bit, I speak. If I feel a lot, I should speak a lot. No, if I feel a lot, if I feel intensely, I don't say anything. Why? Because the words cannot capture the essential feeling. So this is all over the board. And that's why the Kabbalah is into the darkness. Because the darkness, the root of darkness is not the absence of light, but the root of darkness is what transcends the light. It's too great to be expressed. And according to the Kabbalah, that's what Korach wanted. Don't want to get into this because we'll be sidetracked. But according to Korach, Aaron represents light. Korach doesn't like Aaron. Why? You're in the light business. Korach says, I don't want light. I want darkness. Why? Because darkness expresses the source of darkness. What's the source of darkness? The source of darkness is the essence of God, which cannot be revealed. It's a mistake because you can't go to the essence without the light. So you have to start with the light and then go to the essence. Okay, so I'm going way off topic, but going back to coming full circle to what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying, in the lifetime of the tzaddik, you could see the revelation. You could see a ray, right? You can't. After the passing of the tzaddik, you can't see, but you can access the essence. So that's life is always a trade-off. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, my question is about, that's a very beautiful comment, but how do we tap into this light? By what if the tzaddik didn't write anything? So of course it's through the writings, but the essence is also, and it lives indefinitely for indefinite time.
Yes, so the way you connect to the tzaddik primarily is through his teachings. That's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman writes here, and that's what he writes in other places. So through the teachings, the tzaddik invests himself in his teachings. The Zohar says, I read the Zohar last night, the Zohar says, it says that no one knows where Moses is buried. Says the Zohar, yeah, we know, he's buried in the Mishnah. In the Mishnah is the burial place of the Zohar, of Moshe. Because Moshe, yeah, you don't know where his body is. You don't know where the light is. You don't know where you can access him physically. But spiritually, his essence, you can find his essence. It's accessible. It's in the book of Moses, the 5 books of Moses, and in the commentary. So in the tzaddik, when we study the tzaddik's Torah, which we're about to do, so here is you can access the essence. In other words, you can actually access the essence of what the righteous person is saying after the passing, even more than the passing. Reminds me of what the Talmud says, even before you get to that stage. The Talmud says, you don't really understand what your teacher said until 40 years. It's based on Moses, because Moses, after the 40 years and after the 40-year journey, Moshe tells the Jewish people, Hashem did not give you a heart to feel, eyes to see, and ears to hear until this day. Till this day, 40 years ago, we heard God speaking at Sinai. Hadn't we heard? Hadn't we seen? So Rashi quotes the Talmud. Talmud says, you cannot really understand. God came to you. God is the best teacher. Moshe is a great teacher. He came to you. You can't really understand it initially. It takes time till it is integrated within your perspective, within your personality. It takes 40 years. So similar idea is with the righteous person. When it's possible that at the time of the teaching, it doesn't really take effect, at least not, it doesn't reach the essence of the audience. But after certainly 40 years later, but certainly after the passing, that's the big idea here. The big idea is based on the Zohar that when you lose the body is revelation. You could see it, it's tangible, it's wonderful. But on the other hand, it's limiting in the sense that it only allows the ray to shine. And again, it's always a trade-off because the essence you can't always feel. The ray is not the essence. That's what life is. And when we're the first half of the month, we celebrate the light. The second half of the month, we celebrate the essence. So wherever we are, that's what we celebrate. So I went way over time. It was supposed to take 5 minutes, took 20 minutes, but that's okay. And now I hope it's okay. Now we go back to the story of Noach and the flood. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead. Yes.
Rabbi, if I may.
Yes, of course.
It's a lunar question.
Go ahead.
So I can appreciate 30 days and you split it in half and it's 15 to 15. But the lunar cycle is 29 and a half days.
Yeah, I meant 30. I meant, yeah, you want to be precise. It's 29 and a half.
So it's a little bit more difficult to divide that.
Yes. But that's why we do, because Steve is pointing out that there's 29 and a half days to the lunar cycle. That's why we have every month we rotate. 1 month, the month is 29 days, and the other month, and the next month it's 30. And then there's 2 months with this variation. Cheshvan and Kislev, there could be variation. Other than those 2 months, it goes back and forth. So that's to handle that. But either way, even in a month, either way, you're going to have the end of the month is going to be no light at all. And you could look at it, like I said, you could look at it as the lowest point of the month. It's the darkness. But the Hasidic commentary is because you touch the essence, that's why there could be a growth. That's why there could be a rebirth. If you want an example, the example is you take a seed and you plant the seed in the earth and you get a tree. So the seed is a wonderful creation. You can eat it. Some of them you can eat. You can look at it. You can put it on your counter. It's wonderful. It's very beautiful. You put it in the earth, a new existence is going to grow out, is going to come out. The tree is going to grow. In between, the seed is going to rot. The seed is going to germinate. It loses its old identity. But that sort of nullification of self allows for the greater growth, right? So that the essence that's within the seed can be, once the essence within the seed is accessed, that's when it can create something new. So that's a physical metaphor for the idea that the darkness is going to create bring a new rebirth because darkness equals essence. That's why you can't get the Hasidim sad, because you make it dark. What do they say? Ah, wonderful, the essence is here, right? So what are you going to do, right? It's a beautiful story about the it's a beautiful story that illustrates his point from Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk and his brother Rabbi Zusha of Anapoli. The story is like this: they're traveling, and I don't know what the crime was, but they're put into prison. What's the difference? Prison or what? Or what's the other word?
They were incarcerated.
Incarcerated, but I'm just saying there's a jail and a prison. What's the difference? I don't know. Whatever.
I don't think there's much of a difference.
Okay, so they're in the prison, and the problem is, you know the story. The problem is that they can't daven. Why? Because there's a big bucket, and that's the bathroom, and it smells, and you can't daven. So Rabbi Elimelech starts crying. Why does he start crying? Because he says that you're not allowed to daven. If you're not allowed to daven, how am I can't daven. I can't connect to God. So he starts crying. So his brother Zusha says, I don't understand. The same God who told you you have to pray told you that in certain circumstances you can't pray. So just like it's a mitzvah to pray, if you could pray, it's a mitzvah not to pray when you can't pray because you're doing God's will. What's the difference if you're doing God's will through praying or doing God's will through not praying? So he sees that's unbelievable. So we mean we're doing a mitzvah by not praying? Is that what you're telling me? It's unbelievable. So they start dancing. And then the guard sees, and then everyone sees, all the other people in the prison see these two guys dancing. So they join the circle, and everybody, the whole prison is dancing away. Now, the prison guard feels like a failure. Here, all the people are so happy and they're dancing. They're supposed to be upset. So he has to investigate. So he asks, why is everyone dancing? He says, we don't know, but those two guys were sitting and pointing at the bucket. And after they had a deep discussion about the bucket, they started dancing. So the guy says, okay, I'm going to show them. I'm going to take away the bucket. And that's what they do. It takes away the bucket. And now they go and they daven mincha and they live happily ever after. And of course, it's a funny story. But the story is, where do you see, in other words, where do you access God? You can access God by praying. That's the light. But you can access God where there's no light. But you still have the capacity to connect to God. You can always have the capacity to connect to God, even in the darkness. And again, the Kabbalah will say, the darkness is the essence. So you can't get them sad. The Hasidim, that's the problem. But that's the story. Okay, that's all by way of introduction. Now we can get back to the rainbow right behind Mark Rosenblatt, and we could talk about going back to Noach. We're at page 39. chapter 8, verse. Well, I guess. Okay, if you want to look, we're going to go 3 places. I want to get to the idea of being fruitful and multiply, to be fruitful and multiply. So if you look at page 39 and you look at verse 17, we'll read 17. Every living being that is with you of all flesh, of birds, of animals, and of all moving things that move on the earth, order them out with you and let them teem on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. This is animals, right? We leave the flood, we leave the earth. We have to repopulate the earth. So this is the animals.
Which verse?
I'm sorry?
Which verse is this?
So this is chapter 8, and I read verse 17, but that's for the animals. We turn the page in a minute, and we're going to read about the human beings. But even before that, I pointed out last week, it's interesting that I'll say it again just for the fun, that in verse 16, it says, go forth from the ark, you and your wife, your sons and your sons' wives. So we pointed out here, Noach and his wife are mentioned together, as opposed to in the beginning of the flood, when they were supposed to enter the ark. There it says Noach and his wife are separate. If you look, I have to find it. If you look at chapter 6, if you go back to page 33, chapter 6, verse 18, you would see, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. Here, Noach and his wife and his sons' wives are separate. Rashi says that means they can't engage in procreation on the ark, only when they depart from the ark. Okay, now, if you turn the page now again to page 41, you get to after that we talked about the offerings last week, so we'll skip that. Maybe we'll go back, but we'll leave that for right now. Chapter 9, verse 1, God blessed Noach and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. So here we have a blessing. Then there's a few commandments, the commandment of that they're allowed to eat the animals, but not to eat a living animal, and the commandment against murder and suicide. All kinds of interesting verses follow. We're going to skip that. We'll go back to it in the future. And the culmination of this paragraph is page 41, verse 7, chapter 9, verse 7. Whoever, and you, be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply on it. So we had 3 verses. We read the verse about the animals. We read the verse of the blessing to be fruitful and multiply in chapter 9, verse 1. And we read about again, if the blessing was in verse 1, then we assume that in verse 7, when it says again, teem on the earth and multiply in it, we assume that that is a commandment, right? So verse 1 is a blessing. It says so clearly. Chapter 9, verse 1, God blessed Noach and his sons, and he said to them, I'll be fruitful and multiply. And then when you get to verse 7, it says, be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply on it. So we assume that second time, verse 7 is the commandment, not just the blessing. Okay, so that's just laying out the verses. Now that you see the verses, now we could discuss and talk about what's really happening here. So if you want to we'll get straight to the Rebbe's commentary here. That what's interesting about this verse is if you compare it to what God tells Adam. And here there's a little bit of a change, right? This is not the first time God tells them to be fruitful and multiply. God tells it to Adam and Eve as well. But that when God is speaking to Adam and Eve, as soon as they're born, as soon as they're created, in chapter 1, I believe, there's already a commandment to be fruitful and multiply. So why does it have to be reiterated to Noach? So the idea here is, obviously, it's a different commandment. So if you look at page 9, go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Right? At this point, we're not going to get into it right now, but at this point, it's still the creation is still male and female together. And verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the bird of the sky, and every living thing that moves on the earth. Okay, so what's happening here? God is also telling Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. If God is telling Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, why does it have to say it again to Noach? So this is a problem. This is a problem that the commentaries address. So there are various opinions. One opinion is that Adam was not commanded to be fruitful and multiply. If you had to make that argument, you would look at verse 28, and you would see that it begins with a blessing. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So the idea of Peru Uravu, be fruitful and multiply, B could mean I command you to be, or B is I give you a blessing that you will be. So some people would say that to Adam and Eve there was no commandment, but to Noach there was a commandment, because like I said, in chapter 9, verse 1, going back to chapter 9, page 41, verse 1, to Noach, it says God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. But then verse 7 on page 41, it says, and you, again, be fruitful and multiply, teem of the earth and multiply, and that says that is a commandment as well. So that's one interpretation, but we're not going to get into that right now. What we want to think about is another interesting word, and that is the word vikivshua. Here they translate it as subdue it. That's based on Rashi's interpretation, but the simple interpretation is vikivshua and conquer it. If you look at verse, again, we're looking at Adam and Eve. I'm sorry for jumping back and forth. Looking at Adam and Eve, chapter 1, verse 28. God blessed and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, but fill the earth and conquer it. Now, I don't know what conquer it means, but we'll discuss that. But we know we have to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and conquer it. Look at Noach, be fruitful and multiply. What it doesn't say conquer it. Right? If you turn back to Noach, and now no more jumping back, that's enough. But now I just showed you that with Adam it says and conquer it, or subdue it and conquer it. And here with Noah, but with Noach it doesn't say that. And you be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply on it. Not vikivshua, not conquer it. Okay, is this a big enough question so we have to deal with it, or is it just a mistake that God forgot to write and conquer it to Noach? Or is this a big deal?
It's not a big enough question. It's still even bigger question, because to Adam, he said, rule over the fish and rule, and here he doesn't.
Right. So is this an upgrade to Noach or a downgrade?
Definitely a downgrade. Why was the flood? The flood was a downgrade.
Very good.
This was the remnant that couldn't be trusted to conquer. They had to adapt.
I am very, very happy that you said this, because I'm going to first prove your point, and I'm going to reiterate what you said and try to prove that point. But then I'm going to show you the novelty of the Hasidic commentary and the Rebbe's teachings, and it flips it on its head and say, of course it's an upgrade. It always has to be an upgrade. We don't do downgrades. And we're going to turn everything on its head and show that no, Noach is really the upgrade. But before we do that, first we have to say the conventional interpretation as laid forth by Jill, and I'm going to add a few spices. One way to think about it is, okay, I just want to say conquer it. Conquer doesn't mean, conquer in English maybe has a connotation of violence. I mean, it is violent, but conquer doesn't mean to destroy. Conquer means you co-opt something, you use it for your benefit. And that's what it seems like what the humanity is supposed to do, what God tells Adam and Eve. You use the world, conquer it, meaning use all the creations in the world to advance the ideas of morality, to advance the ideas of kindness, of goodness and kindness, to create a Garden of Eden in the world. That's what God is telling Adam and Eve. So many commentaries say what Jill says. After the flood,
But there is another thing also, that is to conquer is a very masculine thing, and it is one-sided.
yes, yeah. So we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Don't worry. We'll get to that both in the positive and the negative. We're gonna we'll unpack all of this. Wonderful. But before that, you're going too fast for us, Jill. We have to start. We're struggling to keep up with you. The first point is God with Adam and Eve. God hopes Adam and Eve can take care of the entire world. Conquer it means influence it and take care of the entire world. What happens with Noach? With Noach, God is like, he lowers his expectations. I'd be very happy, Mr. Noach, if you take care of yourself, right? Let's not worry about taking care of the whole world, right? Adam and Eve were commanded to conquer it, to rule over all the animals, to rule over everything. And why? Because they were on a high spiritual level, so they could influence everybody else. With Noach, the conventional interpretation reads, Noach is much weaker spiritually. The world has been weakened spiritually, and therefore God says, I'll be very happy to take care of yourself. But there's no commandment, could you please go and influence the rest of the world? Why not? We can't. So the expectations have been lowered. Yeah, that makes sense? Makes sense, Tim? If sometimes my mother tells me, take care of all your siblings. Sometimes she says, just take care of yourself. Get yourself dressed. Don't worry about everybody else, right? Because you can't take care of everyone else. If you take care of yourself, we'll be happy. So that's exactly what's happening here with the commandment according to the conventional interpretation. But then we have to read the Hasidic interpretation. And the Hasidic interpretation, as I told you, is going to flip everything on its head. And the Hasidic interpretation is related to the overall story of the flood, as we discussed. That the overall story of the flood could be read as a story of destruction, but it can also be read as a story of purification. And if the world is purified through the flood, then the commandment changes. And this is going to tie into the big picture of how come right after this, God says there will never be a flood again. And he makes the sign of the rainbow. So something here, the fact that there will never be a flood again ties into the upgrade. So what does the Rebbe talk about? The Rebbe spoke about the last Shabbat Noach before he got sick, 1991, Shabbat Noach. And the whole talk for probably 2 hours about the whole picture, the whole story of Noach. And the idea is like this, and this is also what Jill said. Jill gave us all the key words here. The idea of conquer represents resistance. So Adam's world, the world was resistant to the purification and to the influence. Why do I say it was resistant, even though there was much more revelation from above? So this we discussed many times that from the Hasidic model, there's milamata from above to below. Above to below, there could be a very great teacher, a very charismatic leader, but the influence is top down. If the influence is top down, it's almost by force, right? If somebody who's very charismatic takes you over, it's not physical violence, but maybe it's emotional aggression, right? Someone who's very dominant and influences you by the force of their personality, but it's not that you really connect to it. It's just you're being influenced by that personality. In a sense, it's a conquest. It's in a sense, it's a dominance of somebody else over your perspective. And in the beginning of creation, going back to the light metaphor, we said there's an advantage to light, advantage to essence. God's light shines. But if God's light shines, it's God's light dominating you. It's not refining you. So there is an element, if Adam and Eve are going to influence the world, it's going to be conquest. It's going to be fill the earth and conquer it. Because the earth itself is not transformed from its own perspective. It's just being influenced by the overwhelming force of the divine light. What happens with the flood? The flood says we're no longer susceptible to divine light, but the earth itself will be purified. We're literally sitting in the mikveh for 40 days and 40 nights with the rain, and then the water is on the earth for a full year, influencing the entire spectrum of time, the entire cycle of time. A full year is the entire cycle of time. And that purity, really, the earth is marinating in the purity. The entire earth, but also the entire concept of time, and everything we have is within the time. When that happens, things change. When that happens now, the earth is now susceptible to change and become purified and become refined, not because of the force of God's light that's going to shine from above, but the people themselves have the potential, not that they did it at that point, it still takes to Abraham, but people themselves have the potential to self-correct and to elevate themselves even without an influence from above. That's why, says the Rebbe, that's why there's no idea, that's why we drop the word kivshuha. We drop the word conquer it. There's no need to conquest. Conquest represents force. It represents somebody else is acting upon you. That somebody else can be God. It could be the light of God. It could be the Garden of Eden. It's wonderful. But the point here is, it's not coming from you. If it's not coming from you, somebody else is quote unquote conquering you. And that's why if you look at the pattern of the first 10 generations from Adam and Eve all the way to Noach, what happened? There was great potential to connect to God in this world from a light from above. But when the people block out that light and they disconnect from God, God says, you know what? The earth cannot correct itself. Because it cannot correct itself, we have to bring the flood. Why can't the world correct itself? Because they don't have the capacity to refine themselves from their own perspective. They're dependent on above, but they blocked out the voice from above. What happens after the flood? Now there's a new model. Even if someone strays away from God, he or she will hear the voice of God from within themselves. Eventually, they have the capacity to return. What's the capacity to return? You hear the voice not from heaven, but you hear it from within yourself. Because my soul itself could talk to me and say, Menachem, you have to shape up. So that is why God says there'll never be a flood again. Why not? If the flood was such a good idea the first time, why isn't it a good idea the second time? Because the first time you had to have a flood because the human being did not have a capacity to self-correct. So if they spiral to the point where they're evil, they're just gonna spiral downward. After the flood, once you have the purification of the flood, now the people themselves can elevate themselves now because now people can refine themselves, they can self-correct. If they can self-correct, there's no need for a flood. But if there's no need for a flood, there's no need for dominance. There's no need for Noach to conquer the world because conquer represents that there's resistance. And the truth is, essentially, there's no resistance. Even though on the surface it may seem there's resistance, but the message of Noach, the message of God, the message of the Torah now is consistent with the perspective of humanity. It may take time to work it out. And therefore, if I influence you, but what I'm telling you resonates with you, then it's not dominance. It's not I'm conquering you. I'm conquering you if I'm changing you. But if I say, if I'm talking to you and it resonates with you, then it's not conquest. Then this is you. This is how you feel. This is how you feel. Then we're being influenced, but not through conquest because we feel it innately. And that is the big picture, the big divide between before the flood and after the flood. And that's why there has to be a flood the first time around. There's no flood after the flood. There's no longer a need for a flood because people could self-correct. And the key here is we don't need to conquer. We don't need to conquer. Why? Because if you look at somebody and you say, I have to influence, the person is so bad. So what's the Rebbe teaching you? What's the Hasidic teaching you based on the world conquest? You don't need to conquer. Conquer means that person resists and I have to break them. I have to change them. You don't have to change anybody. Understand that what you're about to say, the message of the Torah, the message of God, and the message of truth is something that resonates within that person. You have to find the right way to communicate it, correct? But once you do, you're not conquering, you're not breaking, you're not changing. What you're doing is you're helping that person discover which resonates with them already. So that's the story in short.
Rabbi,
You're next.
can I
Yes, please go ahead.
can I ask a question? So the first time around, the animal kingdom was created. The second time, the animals came together with Noah. So if the Rebbe refers to the animal kingdom like in the broader world, then it doesn't make that much sense. But if he talks about conquering the animal that's within you or other human beings, then yes, because the world was purified. But does he talk about anything about animals coming, not created? Because during the flood, Noah was taking care of them.
Right.
That
So mystically
make
speaking,
any difference?
mystically speaking, is not just when the human being influences not just the animal within themselves, but they influence everything in the world, including the animals, including the vegetable kingdom, the vegetation, and including the inanimates, because we know that everything has a soul. Like with Arizal taught, everything has a soul, even the domain, even the inanimate has a soul. So what we're saying, even though you need to be a mystic to see this, not that I am a mystic, I don't see it, but the physical substance of the world now wants to hear the voice of God, wants to reflect the voice of God. So it's true on a mystical level about everything, but you're right. In a psychological level, we're talking about the animal within the soul, within the person, the animal within the person. But broadly speaking, the question is the world resistant to the word of God, or is the world susceptible to the word of God? That's the big discussion. And the big change is the flood. Before the flood, the world is resistant. And therefore, Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden, and the garden is a wonderful place. But the garden is only a wonderful place because God keeps sending it flow. God is influencing it, right? If you're a gardener, and even if the soil, you want a metaphor, okay? Let's say you have a backyard. Let's say you don't live in Brooklyn and you have a backyard, let's say. And then you have a soil, and the soil is not good soil. So you can't create a garden. But I guarantee you that if you bring one of these gardeners, doesn't matter what soil they have, if they tend to the garden every day, you will have a beautiful garden, right? Every day, anything goes wrong, they'll put in a new tree, whatever it is. The gardener is constantly tending to the soil, to the garden. You will have a beautiful garden. That's the Garden of Eden. Problem is, we get tired of the gardener, we throw him out. What's going to happen? The garden deteriorates. Why? Because the soil cannot sustain this garden. What happens after the flood? We have no gardener. It's going to take us much longer to recreate the Garden of Eden. It's going to take us 6,000 years to recreate the Garden of Eden. But what changed is the soil changed. Now we don't have a gardener, but we have great soil. And if we have great soil, that's from the beloved. So we don't have the flow from above. We don't have the gardener. We have great soil. We have great soil. Eventually, if you have a little patience, or like my mother used to say, hold your horses. If you hold your horses, then eventually you will get a nice garden. Why? Even if you're like me, you have no idea what you're doing. Every year you plant a little bit of grass, and then when the next season comes out, you see patches. Or you have this. You don't want to hear the story about my gardening, but the bottom line is, eventually, even if you're a gardener like I am, eventually you'll get a nice garden. Why? Because you have good soil. The flood makes the good soil. That is the shift. And therefore, you don't have to conquer. In the Garden of Eden, you're conquering the soil. What do I mean you're conquering the soil? You're superimposing the good plants, and you're superimposing the grass, and you're superimposing water and sunlight, and you're sort of forcing the soil to go along with your vision of the world. And it could work as long as you let the gardener stay. But the moment you boot the gardener, it's going to deteriorate. On the other hand, after the flood, you don't have to conquer the soil. It takes time. It's a process. Eventually, the soil is here for you. It's willing and able to go along with your vision for humanity. And that is the shift that the Hasidic philosophy believes takes place after the flood. And therefore, you know what? You don't have to destroy the garden because the soil is perfect. Go ahead, Steve.
Did the flood, was it an upgrade also to human nature? For example, Noah was the most righteous of his generation. But given that Noah was an alcoholic, that doesn't say much about his generation. So didn't the flood, it could be that the flood actually changed human nature and allow there to be an existence of a truth goddess.
Yes. So
there was not.
So the answer is that Steve wants to know if the flood upgraded the human nature, and the answer is yes. But go back to the answer I just said, and go back to your discussion of light and essence. After the flood, we're never going to be like Adam. Adam was tended to by the gardener himself. See what I'm saying? In other words, you want a metaphor. You'll understand this metaphor. If you have the best teacher you're the best mathematics teacher in the entire world teaches you, okay? And you're a very dedicated disciple. So you hear everything he said. Okay, that's one model. The other model is you don't have a good mathematics teacher, but you're able to discover the wisdom by yourself. So who's on a higher level? Well, the person who has the greater teacher maybe knows more mathematics, but the person who's self-taught, in some sense, the teachings are internalized within them because they can self-generate wisdom. So in that sense, human nature changed. now we could generate wisdom. Now, ultimately, we could produce our own garden. But it is a downgrade, and that's why Jill was right. On one level, it is a downgrade. You don't have the teacher coming and doing everything for you. You don't have the parent coming and doing everything for you. If you're a parent, there's two models. One model is you tell your child, could you clean up your room? They do. They tell you it's clean. It's not clean. Trust me. Then the other model is you clean it yourself. When you clean it yourself, it's much cleaner. But that's not the goal. The goal is to allow them to clean their room. So that's the same pattern. On one hand, what God will do for you, the world God creates, the paradise that God creates is going to be greater. On the other hand, what we can create on our own is a lower level, but it's self-generated. It's self-generated, doesn't need conquest. Okay, we only have 8 minutes left, and I must get to what Jill talked about, is the masculine aspect and the feminine aspect, and how that connects to the halacha, to the law, and to the philosophy. So this is interesting. You ready? Here, we're starting the journey. Everything so far, everything is good? One of the things the Talmud learns from that verse when God says, fill the earth and conquer it, Shua, and conquer it, is a very, very, very strange commandment. If you haven't heard this, if you have been teaching, if you haven't heard this, you're going to find it strange. It sounds unfair and totally strange. Talmud says like this. You probably heard this before, probably. The commandment, this is crazy, I feel bad saying this, but I'll say it anyway. The commandment to be fruitful and multiply is upon who? Male or female? If you had to guess.
Can't have one without the other.
Okay, but that's it, primary commandment.
Rabbi, it has to be both. I mean, and they were one to start with, so it has to be both. So you
Okay.
can't just say it's
Okay.
masculine,
Go
because I know
along.
you're going to say it.
I'm going to say it's masculine. I'm going to say it's masculine. The commandment is on the man, not on the woman, which is totally strange. First of all, it's strange because you need both. Second of all, who does all the heavy lifting? Right? Not the man, it's the woman. So it's a very strange thing. But let me tell you what the Talmud says, and let me tell you if the Hasidic interpretation could explain it. The Talmud says like this. The commandment, Ish Mitzvah, by the way, it's a debate. There's two opinions. One opinion says what Jill says. One opinion says what Jill says. When the verse says, be fruitful and multiply, the verse says, God created male and female. At that point, there's still one. So the commandment is to male and female. That's one interpretation. That's a valid interpretation. That's a Talmudic interpretation. And that's the one that sounds more logical. But then there's the other interpretation, which is more Talmudic. And there's always a catch. And they say, look, since the verse says, be fruitful and multiply and conquer the earth, says the Talmud, who are we talking about? Who conquers? Well, I don't know who goes to war today. Today, females go and fight battles. But in the ancient world, the Talmud says, Ha'ish kol lichbosh. Man, it's man's custom to conquer. It's not woman's custom to conquer. So if you say conquer, you're talking about the masculine elements. If you're talking about the male, then if it says conquer, we can't be talking to the women. Women don't conquer. So therefore, says the Talmud, this opinion says that must be that the commandment to be fruitful and multiply is only on the man, not on the woman. Why? Because the subject is conquest. Women are not in the business of conquest. That's what the Talmud says, which is totally strange because Jill says it's not fair. I say it's not fair. I also say not only it should be equal, but the woman should get the commandment because the woman does all the work. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, if it's time bound,
Yeah,
then the woman does not have an obligation.
but it's not time bound.
But yeah, and it's the woman that has cycles and time. So for the woman, it's time bound. So it's an obligation.
Okay, fine. That's you're going into law. You're getting into the technicalities of the law. But I want to say it doesn't feel right. What does it
But
mean?
it's about not being able to, not having a mitzvah that will cause pain or possible death.
Okay, so now you have another legal answer. The Jews are lawyers; they have good answers. So the answer that Steve says it's time bound. Elisa says, look, Elisa says a very interesting concept. The concept is it's for the woman, it's a danger. Mortality rates for the mothers was very high in the ancient world. It's a danger. Torah cannot command you to put yourself in danger. All good answers. There's a Hasidic. There's a cute, funny answer, but it's not that funny. It really is true. And once we get to the Hasidic interpretation, you'll see how true it is. But the cute answer is that the woman doesn't have to be commanded because the woman wants to do so naturally. the man has to be commanded. If there'll be no commandment for the man, he would check out. So it's cute, but you'll see in a minute how deep this concept is. So when the Rebbe talked about this subject, and you'll see what the Rebbe did. Give me a minute or two. Yeah, so we have 4 minutes. And we know that when the Rebbe saw the feminism, the Rebbe thought that that's bringing us closer to the redemption. And here it is. What does it mean that man is in the conquest business? The custom of man is to conquer, and the custom of woman is not to conquer. What does that mean? Now again, I'm just going to give the what's the word I'm looking for? The disclaimer that when we say man and woman, we mean masculine and feminine. So it doesn't necessarily break down exactly biologically, because according to the Kabbalah, every soul has 10 attributes. Some of those are masculine, some of those are feminine. So with some men, the feminine could be dominant. With some women, the masculine could be dominant. So we're thinking about the concept of masculinity and femininity. And think about it this way. Says the Rebbe as follows. When you say a man wants to conquer, it doesn't mean he wants to go to war and bomb you with an F-16. It means that in the nature of man is to impose his perspective and his opinion. And that's why if you ever have a problem and you want empathy, don't go to a man. Because what the man is going to do, the man's going to solve your problem. Okay? Now, you don't necessarily want to solve the problem. You certainly don't necessarily want his solution. But that's what naturally, that's what a man's going to do. You're going to say, I have a problem. And say, okay, so change schools, quit your job, whatever. They're always going to give you a solution. Why? Because man's nature, again, not man, the masculine nature is to conquer. Conquer means impose, superimpose my perspective. What is the nature of the feminine? Not to conquer. To conquer, you want a solution, go to the man. What the woman is going to do, the woman will talk to you, and the woman will help you understand and help you discover how you should solve the problem, what your perspective is. In other words, it's much more cultivating than conquering. And in that sense, everything is going to connect. Because before the flood, the model was, God says, fill the earth and conquer it. What does it mean? You have to conquer it. What does it mean you have to conquer it? You have to superimpose the holiness upon the nature of the world. The soil of the earth of the world is not that good. You have to constantly superimpose holiness into the world. Who primarily does this? Man. Here it says conquer. Who primarily does this? Man. Why? Because if you have to conquer, if you have to superimpose, that's the masculine quality. After the flood, you don't have to superimpose the holiness onto the world, because the soil of the earth itself, meaning, and that's a metaphor, meaning that the creation itself innately is ready to hear and ready to connect to God. You just have to discover it. If that's the case, you don't have to conquer the world. You have to cultivate the world. If that's the case, we're not going to say masculine. We're not going to say conquer it, because now it's the feminine aspect of bringing the world to perfection. And that's why it doesn't say conquer it. And that's why, according to the mystical teachings of Judaism, not just the Medrash says that the Jewish people left Egypt in the merit of the Jewish woman. The Kabbalists say that the same thing will be in the future redemption. We'll leave the last exile we're in because of the Jewish woman. And what the Rebbe says is, what we mean is the idea, the feminine way of relating to people, of relationships. And that is, it's not superimposing, but it's cultivating. And in that sense, the world is not the enemy. The world is the soil that could be worked at. And now go back to that same question of within man and say, man is not going to want to procreate unless it's commanded. And the woman doesn't have, and the woman, not all, I don't want to generalize, but if you have to generalize, you would say that woman would feel the desire to procreate more naturally. That is a symbol for the masculine energy and the feminine energy. We are within the feminine energy, the divine will does not have to be superimposed. It's felt within the self. For the man, what is procreation? Procreation is transcending yourself. You have somebody else you have to take care of, someone else you have to give to. It's a very difficult thing to do, to transcend the self and put yourself aside for somebody else. For the man has to sort of force themselves to do so, generally speaking. That's the conquest aspect. That's why man has to be commanded, because it's not as natural. For the woman, it's more natural. Not all women, but for the feminine aspect of humanity, it's more natural. And again, that's just a reflection of the big picture. What the Rebbe says is that the fact that we drop the word conquer it, is not a downgrade like many commentaries point out. Many commentaries thought that it's a downgrade. Now we don't have the ability to influence the world. So now we drop the idea of conquer the earth. Just take care of yourself. That's the negative perspective. But the Hasidic perspective is, no, we don't have to conquer the world anymore. Why? Because the soil has been refined. When you recognize opposition, when you face opposition, negativity within the world, you could see it as something that has to be conquered, or you could see it as something that could be cultivated. Now, that cultivation may take 6,000 years, right? Don't ask me a question. My neighbor is not so nice. I try to cultivate them, and they're not kind. Okay, so it'll take you another 6,000 years. It's fine. But the point is, there's no need to flood. There's no need to destruction, because ultimately, deep down within the bedrock of humanity is the ability to be in tune and to resonate with the word of God. And it's our job to tend to the garden, not from the top down, not by hiring a good gardener, but by discovering the qualities of the soil within the earth. So this is a little bit mystical and a little bit abstract, but I hope I was able to convey at least a little bit of the beauty here. And again, the ramifications are profound, right? How do we look at the world? Is the world a negative place that we have to destroy and conquer, or is the world a place that needs to be cultivated? It's a totally different perspective. It's a total different perspective, and it really would affect every aspect of how we see our purpose in this world. And it probably, if we had time to elaborate, it'll probably also explains a lot about the Rebbe's perspective and the Rebbe's life, where he always believed in the good within humanity, because he wasn't distracted by the layers of concealment, because he understood that deep down, you don't have to conquer anybody. Deep down, the person has the soil. The person is able, the holiness resonates within the person. It's only a question of how deep you have to drill, but it's not a question of conquest. So that's the story in short. And maybe internalize the message and realize that we ourselves and the world around us and the people around us, we should move away maybe from the conquest method, which is you're evil, your perspective is wrong, I have to crash through it and superimpose my solution to your problem, and move to the feminine perspective, which is you have everything it takes to solve your problem. You may need a little encouragement to find that within yourself, and that's what we're here for. Of course, you need both masculine and feminine, but the question is, which one is more dominant? And certainly before Mashiach comes, it's the feminine aspect more dominant, and that's based on the Kabbalah. That's enough for right now, because we're going over time. Thank you for joining, and it's been a lot of fun, so thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Is there a difference with someone with a true Rasha, like an Amalek, or would the Rebbe still say that deep down is the holiness?
Well, the answer is there has to be, the Kabbalistic answer has to be yes. Deep down, everything comes from God. Everything has a spark of God. The question is, what is the way to, how do you access it? And some things you can't access. Some things, is a halachic term that says certain vessels cannot be purified. If you have a earthenware vessel, it can't be purified. You can't take it to the mikvah, you can't do it. The only thing you can do is break it. If you break it and then reform it in the kiln, then then it's pure. So the Talmudic concept is shvirasan zui takanasan. Breaking it is the fixing it. Sometimes the spark is so locked, you have to break the shell to be able to get to the spark. So that happens. That is true, but that is the exception to the rule, not to the rule. Of course, you need both masculine and feminine in this world. The question is which one is more dominant, and the question is overall. Overall is that what God wants. What does God want? Not what he wants. What does he need? Does he need us to conquer or cultivate? So, as a general rule, it's cultivate. Of course, there are certain pockets that have to be broken, but even that, I would argue, it's the shell that has to be broken, not the energy. But you're right. You need masculine. You need to conquer. There's no question about that. Some things, the way to heal it is to break it. But ultimately, yeah. But again,
Rabbi,
that's the exception to the rule, which proves the rule. Go ahead, Jill.
There's also the realization of the locus of God is not just transpersonal, but immanent.
Right.
So now this has become much more internal, this becomes part of Judaism.
Right. And then
That it doesn't just come from the top, as you put it. It's now it is up to you, but you can ask the questions of the God within.
and you could hear the voice. You could hear the voice from within. You could hear there's a beautiful image. It's a beautiful image.
But that's because there is an immanent quality to God as well.
Amen. Correct. Absolutely.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can I ask a question? Does Rabbi talk about anything about transformation of Noah by taking care of the animals? Because maybe that's more like a caring female part of him developing during the being on the ark. Because not only the earth is transformed, but the Noah himself.
I have to look. I make a confession. I read the Rebbe's talk yesterday, but it was 6 p.m. and it's very nuanced. So I have to go back and check if he talks about that aspect. Other people talk about that aspect in other matters. That, for example, we're going to get to the point that Noach's allowed to eat the animals. Why is he allowed to eat the animals? He takes ownership. The fact that he tended to them, they become his. But I'll go back and check if this is tied into, if the Rebbe makes the connection. If the Rebbe doesn't, then we'll do it.
Yeah, because it makes sense, like transformation on both sides.
Right.
And that proves the point that it is an upgrade in a way from both sides.
Noach now becomes someone who is, I would say, feminine, really. He's taking the animals. He's raising animals for a full year. He's a zoologist. That is fantastic.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Rabbi, can I ask a question from
Of course.
Ms.
Everybody
Parsha?
wants to learn. This is unbelievable. Go ahead. Nobody wants to leave.
From Ms. Parsha, when they refer to the milk and honey in Egypt, what are they referring to?
What are they referring to? I don't know. I think they're referring to the idea that they don't want. They say, we remember, for example, 2 portions ago in Bahalotcha, they say, remember the fish that we ate in Egypt for free. So Rashi says they wouldn't have anything for free. They were slaves. They didn't have anything for free. So Rashi says, oh, no, they were free from mitzvot.
Right.
So they were free of moral obligation. Sometimes a person would rather have physical subjugation than have moral subjugation, because some moral subjugation is, in other words, moral responsibility goes along with you wherever you are. Even if you're a servant, you have time for yourself. But if you're a servant of God, then you never have free time, because God is always there. So that is a certain sweetness that they perceive as freedom. That could be that's what they were referring to.
And just for the Hebrew class that we were talking about, is it too late to change the time, or
No. Email me later. Email me. Yeah, not too late. Okay, wonderful day, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you for joining.
Yes, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.